All right, time to wrap it up. Terry Eagleton, Ideology, an Introduction, the conclusion. Okay, so we've been through a long story with Mr. Eagleton. Very interesting, very controversial, and I think rather entertaining. I think he's a bit of fun to read. Okay, so how does he conclude? So he says, I've gone through a lot of stuff, and I've looked at all these things, and I'm going to try and summarize and give us what he thinks. Well, you know what? He kind of told us in the first chapter when he listed all the different views. Remember, way back in the beginning, when he talked about all these definitions of ideology and all these properties you could find of ideology and all these various strategies and all this. And he did say more or less at the beginning, yeah, they're all useful to a certain degree, some more useful than others, etc., etc. And in the end, he doesn't really tell us exactly what ideology is, but that's okay because there's lots of terms that we use that are family resemblance terms, and one thing we might want to let go of is that, the minute we start talking about something, we have to have a single, perfect, universal definition. Beware of that. That's a good lesson that Wittgenstein has taught us, and it's always one to consider. But remember, Wittgenstein didn't say that every term was a family resemblance term. He just said, look, a lot of the times that we have a term, its meaning is its use. Not every time, but a lot of terms, its meaning, their meaning is their use. They get used in different ways, and these ways have kind of overlapping things. So the term that you're using is probably a family resemblance term, but not terms in mathematics and science and things like that. Wittgenstein did not think that the notion of terms in mathematics were completely family resemblance terms, or certainly the notion of terms in physics. He didn't really think that. He had certain views of what they were, and he just wasn't necessarily a Platonist, but he didn't think that everything he said about family resemblance and meaning and use and all that stuff applied to every term in language. So don't take it too far. But still, the lesson is I think very appropriate here with the question of ideology, especially the way that Eagleton has looked at it over all these chapters. So ideology has a broad range, all the way from like social determination of thought, which he thinks is unworkable and too broad, down to, oh no, it's not that. It's the direct sort of tool of power, the employment and false ideas in the service of a ruling class, which is, again, a lot of people think that's what an ideology is. He thinks that's suspiciously narrow. So to say that it determines everything, or it's just some secret group that's using it, it's full of falsities and they're just shaping everything and this lying to get what they want, both of those are largely unworkable. You might find instances of it, but that's not the right way to go when we're framing our thinking about ideologies. Ideology, yeah, they often refers to signs that duplicate and preserve power. He thinks that's kind of a negative way, and sometimes that'll work. Or any significant conjuncture between discourse and political interest. That's a little bit more neutral. He says both of these they have their uses. So all of these have their uses, but we should not get hung up on any one and say that's that's the only way we can think about ideologies. They all have to conform like to that, and then shoehorn every example that comes along into it, no matter what. So that's again sort of a certain kind of discourse. We will say this is the way to talk about ideologies and no other way. Well, that's too cognitively narrow, and we're going to miss out on important things of ideologies. Why? Because ideologies are affecting, as Socrates would say, the most important thing, how we live, right? And we don't want to have some sort of Procrustean bed of thinking about ideologies and then force them all into that and lose sight of what much of them might be doing simply because our frameworks don't allow for us to think and ask those questions. All right, rationalist accounts of ideologies. He thinks that that they're conscious, kind of like over here, that they're conscious, well-articulated systems of beliefs. These are inadequate, right? They miss the mythical, symbolic dimensions of ideologies, the affective, the ways that ideologies serve to constitute, as we've seen, constitutes subjects, right? A large part of an ideology actually is part of the construction of the subject that lives within that ideology. So it's a lived kind of lived construction of relations. Um, Nonetheless, he thinks, yeah, but we shouldn't go the other way and say, oh, well, it's all this kind of mythical narrative stuff and it's got nothing to do with true and false. No, they have cognitive. Yes, they do often have cognitive content that we can evaluate. That is, yes, to saying true, false, and stuff with ideologies. And he also makes an important point, I think, that a lot of people forget when they talk about ideologies, is that in order for them to be effective, and lots of them are, it is problematic to insist that an ideology is effective, dangerous, and growing and all these kinds of things, and then at the same time say it's just completely devoid of truth. No, that actually is the wrong move, and I think Eagleton has stressed that numerous times that ideologies, for them to work, even the dangerous ones, they have to contain some elements of truth. And as people can often use truth and you misuse it as well. Using true statements to maybe generate things that they want. Maybe I'm just, as an ideologue, I'm giving you all kinds of things that may be blatant falsehoods, but I throw in a number of things that are true that can easily be used. Well, it's not completely wrong, so let's hear what he's saying. He must be saying something right. That's kind of a bit of a trick. So in that sense, they are often marbled with truth. But nonetheless, as Eagleton also goes on to say, that ideologies also contain blatant falsehoods. And these blatant falsehoods are present not so much as sort of the inner nature of ideologies. Oh, they have to have falsehoods. Not necessarily that. But these ideologies are usually pressed into service of justifying oppressions and things like that. So they will bring in things that are blatant falsehoods, like distinctions that we would reject out of hand, that there are groups of human beings that we can identify that really in the end are humans, right? And things like that. So it's okay to say bad things and do bad things to them. These kinds of falsehoods. Now, notice though, if you agree with that and and say something like, oh yeah, I don't believe in making those kinds of distinctions, those are falsehoods and all that. Yes, okay, they're blatant falsehoods and they're pressed into the service, etc., etc. That does presuppose in the end that subjects are not entirely constituted. And even if you look at Eagleton's writings, that there's some kind of window, there's some kind of subject that can look at this and go, well, I don't agree with that. That's a falsehood. And not only just simply recognizing falsehood, but stuff that's immoral. You might say, well, that distinction isn't just simply a distinction between something that's tall or short or something like that. That distinction that you made with people, that's an immoral distinction. That's a moral problem to make that distinction. Well, in order to be able to make that claim that distinction is immoral, that would say something to the effect that we're not totally subsumed by ideologies, that we have some way of standing outside them in some sense for this to even these kinds of claims about ideologies to make even make sense. All right, so then he goes into kind of a rehash of a lot of things that he's talked about that I like. Ideologies, I just abbreviation of ideology, ID. Ideologies have lots of properties. So we've seen all these, right? They unite, not always, not perfectly. So think of this list of properties as sometimes but not always, often but sometimes not, that kind of thing. Sometimes they unite, and when they do, they don't really perfectly unite. Why? Because remember, ideologies negotiate with pre-existing truths, pre-existing beliefs. Sometimes ideologies will negotiate with other ideologies, etc., etc. And that's just a way of saying that the people that are pushing these ideologies have to sort of try and accommodate where the people are that they're trying to get them to believe in the ideology, that there's negotiation going on. Ideologies also sometimes, and sometimes not, they naturalize. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They universalize, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes ideologies are just a class viewpoint, not always. Sometimes they are, secretions of economic conditions. Not always. And that's why sometimes people can get thrown by why does this group of people believe something? I thought that was always an expression of this class. Why are they false? You got to be careful about that, is taking it an absolute rigid notion of all ideologies are expressions of certain particular class viewpoints. No, and in this world today, when we think of lots of things that are ideologies and viewpoints that are strongly held, it sometimes it cuts across all kinds of classes, right? And so that doesn't mean it's not an ideology anymore. It just means that ideologies can sometimes cut across very large class distinctions. It's the old expression that politicians make strange bedfellows. Well, so do ideologies. Ideologies can often contain people that you would never think would agree on anything, and there they are in the same ideological camp. Yes, ideologies can be sometimes thought of as cognitive maps. They sometimes are agency strippers, where, like someone just kind of hands their thinking over to the ideological thing and gets their answers totally from that and follows it blindly. Sure, that happens, not always, and it doesn't always completely happen. Ideologies are often connected to mythologies and narratives. And it's easy to overestimate this. Oh, that ideology is just this giant mythological narrative that, right? Yeah, it's easy to overestimate the power of that, and then to assume that everybody in the ideology has been stripped of agency completely. That's always possible. Oh, another thing, class viewpoint. As I said, it can cut across classes. Sometimes ideologies are from those in power, from those oppressed. So it's not the case that ideology is always an expression of a dominant power's viewpoint. It can be expressions of other kinds of viewpoints. Gramsci, as we saw, thinks that, yeah, there are ideological formations in the oppressed class, and he tells a story of how those have to be put together by the organic intellectual. All right. The ideologies are also, yes, they are linked to discursive practices, but not always. They're not always just language. Yes, they have connections to the notion of semiotic closure, where this language is used in this way for these purposes. So there's a power dimension that tells you how these terms are used, but this is not always bad. Lots of things that we might say, yeah, this is semiotic closure, this is some semantic kind of force that forces people to use words in certain ways. That's not always bad. That sometimes generates good things in society. Good protest movements have semantic closure, rather than this wild anarchic kind of thing of signifiers can do anything and we're not going to put the brakes or boundaries at all. All right, so in the end, as you notice, I drew this big thing around all of this mess, right? These are there's a family resemblance. It's a family ideology is a family resemblance term. Oh yeah, and also institutions, right? So even far away from the subject, back over here, they're embedded in society. Ideologies can be embedded in institutions. These have real effects, and these are not necessarily ideologies that would be beliefs, right? Institutional ideologies, they are very structures that we live in, but they're not just simply beliefs. We've seen a little bit of commodity fetishism from Marx. This isn't something simply psychological, right? This is embedded right into the systems of relations that people live. Okay, so lots going on in here. And he then he says, okay, so the family resemblance thing. So be very cautious. Be very cautious. What's the sort of the upshot of all this? When someone tries to tell you what an ideology is, be cautious. If they say, oh, and all ideologies contain property Q or Z, be careful. Well, maybe Q, Z, and R, still be careful of that. So a single property that's invariant through all ideologies, probably not. Just like there's no single property that links everybody up in a family, right? Some people have Aunt Petunia's nose and Uncle Ned's ears, or vice versa, or something like that. Be careful. It's probably, we should just think of it best as a family resemblance term. So there's no, another way to put it is there's no real essence to ideology. But if he says, if you're a rational observer with a calm, cool perspective, what exactly that means, I don't know, but I think it's just, trying to be objective about things as much as you can. When we do look at dominant ideologies, says Eagleton, you can't help but feel a little bit of ease at the grip that these things do have, either on society or significant sections of society. He's sort of kind of trying to pull back, when the sage becomes an ordinary person, right? We've gone through all this, but let us sit back now as ordinary people and just kind of reflect on, yeah, there's a lot of ideologies, and they do have good, strong, not good, but very powerful grips on people. So when we look at this, it's hard to feel at ease with this. We would naturally feel, as Eagleton says, ill at ease when we look at this. And he thinks that there is a place where we can that is transformative. This is what he calls the active political struggle. What is it? It's not a grandiose nature. It's actually quite calm, quite simple. It's in sort of this, again, back from the sage and all this stuff, down to the everyday notion of people engaged in kind of quiet local struggle when they come up against the power of the state, and they say things like, no, this is wrong. We don't want our state to work this way. We want something different. These mild local forms of political resistance in confrontation with state power, and that's where people have their ideas changed radically. And sometimes when you see on the news, you will often, well, quite often you'll see on the news where someone will say, again, just an average person, working an average job, everything, pretty straightforward, in no great position of power, will say something like, well, I kind of was seeing what was going on and I didn't like this and I got involved. And the more I got involved and the reaction by kind of the authorities, and, I was quite surprised at how strong the reaction was. And I decided, no, I'm going to protest this, and I don't think this is right. And I've never done it, and lots of times you hear this, I've never done anything like this before, but this issue is an important one. And this sort of calm, local kind of protest, this is the transformational part of when ideologies can be seriously opposed. And if a theory of ideology at the end of it all is going to have any value, it's going to help us, it should help us to figure out how we can liberate ourselves from what Eagleton calls these death-dealing beliefs, but basically to help us figure out how we can liberate ourselves and others from oppressive structures. All right, that brings me to the end of the book and the end of this series of videos on Eagleton's ideology. I hope you enjoyed them.